Tonight, we journey back 2,300 years to ancient Greece, where a man of insatiable curiosity sought to understand everything from the movement of the stars to the nature of happiness. His name was Aristotle, and his systematic investigation of reality created the foundations of Western science, logic, ethics, and political thought. This is not merely a story of abstract ideas, it is a story of a remarkable life, of mentorship and rivalry, of exile and return, of a mind that refused to leave any question unexamined. Join me as we explore the life and teachings of the philosopher who taught us how to think. The story begins in 384 BCE in the small town of Stagira, on the northern edge of the Greek world near the Kingdom of Macedonia. Here, far from the intellectual centers of Athens and the Greek mainland, a boy named Aristotle was born into a family with close ties to power. His father Nicomachus served as personal physician to King Amyntas III of Macedonia, grandfather of the future Alexander the Great. This connection to the Macedonian court would shape Aristotle's life in ways no one could have predicted. Growing up in a physician's household left deep marks on young Aristotle. Medicine in ancient Greece combined careful observation with theoretical reasoning. Physicians examined patients, noted symptoms, tracked the course of diseases, and developed theories about bodily humors and their balance. This empirical approach, this insistence on looking closely at the world before theorizing about it, became fundamental to Aristotle's method. Where other philosophers started with abstract principles, Aristotle always began with observation. Tragedy struck early in Aristotle's life. Both his parents died while he was still young, leaving him an orphan. A family friend named Proxenus became his guardian, raising the boy and eventually sending him to Athens for education. At 17, Aristotle arrived in the great city that had produced Socrates and was now home to Plato's academy, the most prestigious school of philosophy in the Greek world. He would remain there for 20 years. The academy that Aristotle entered was no ordinary school. Founded by Plato around 387 BCE, it brought together the finest minds in Greece for sustained philosophical inquiry. Students did not simply attend lectures, but lived in a community devoted to the pursuit of truth. They studied mathematics, astronomy, and dialectic. They engaged in constant discussion and debate. They read and criticized each other's work. It was the closest thing the ancient world had to a modern research university. Plato himself presided over this community, now in his 60s and at the height of his intellectual powers. The author of the Republic and the Symposium, the creator of the theory of forms, the heir to Socrates' mission of philosophical questioning, Plato was the dominant figure in Greek philosophy. The young Aristotle from the provincial north found himself studying under the greatest thinker of the age. The relationship between these two giants would prove both fruitful and fraught. Aristotle threw himself into the life of the academy with extraordinary energy. He read voraciously, mastering not only Plato's dialogues but the works of earlier philosophers. He excelled in dialectical debate, earning the nickname the Reader for his bookish habits and the mind of the school for his intellectual prowess. Plato reportedly called him the foal who kicks the mare that bore him, recognizing both his brilliance and his tendency to challenge his teacher's views. The philosophical differences between Plato and Aristotle emerged gradually but proved fundamental. Plato believed that true reality consisted of eternal forms existing beyond the physical world. The particular things we see, individual horses and trees and just actions, were mere shadows or copies of these perfect forms. Knowledge meant turning away from the sensory world toward the intelligible realm of forms. The philosopher's task was to ascend from appearances to eternal truth. Aristotle came to reject this picture of reality. He could not accept that the forms existed separately from particular things. Where was this separate realm? How did forms in that realm cause effects in our world? The theory seemed to multiply entities beyond necessity. Aristotle developed an alternative view. Forms existed, but they existed in particular things, not apart from them. The form of a horse was real, but it existed only in actual horses, not in some separate heaven of forms. This disagreement was not merely technical, but reflected different temperaments and methods. Plato was drawn to mathematics, to the certainty and abstraction of geometric proof. Aristotle was drawn to biology, to the careful observation of living things in all their messy particularity. Plato looked up toward eternal truths. Aristotle looked around at the world before him. Both approaches had value, but they led in different directions. Despite these differences, Aristotle remained at the academy for 2 decades, until Plato's death in 347 BCE. When the time came to choose Plato's successor, the position went not to Aristotle, but to Plato's nephew Speusippus. Whether this reflected anti-Macedonian sentiment in Athens, dissatisfaction with Aristotle's philosophical departures, or simple family preference remains unclear. But Aristotle, now nearly 40, left Athens to begin a new chapter of his life. He traveled first to Assos, a city on the coast of Asia Minor ruled by Hermias, a former slave who had risen to become a philosopher king of sorts. Hermias had studied at the academy and welcomed Aristotle warmly. Here, Aristotle established a small philosophical community, continuing his research and teaching. He also married Pythias, the niece and adopted daughter of Hermias. Their relationship appears to have been genuinely loving. Aristotle's will requested that her bones be buried with his own. During this period, Aristotle began the biological research that would occupy him for years. The coastal location provided access to marine life. Aristotle dissected sea creatures, observed their anatomy, noted their behaviors, classified them into groups. He was creating the science of biology virtually from scratch. His observations were remarkably accurate. Some were not confirmed until the invention of the microscope 2,000 years later. The physician's son had found his true calling in the systematic study of living things. Tragedy intervened again when Hermias was captured by the Persians, tortured for information about Macedonian military plans, and executed. Aristotle fled with his wife and daughter to the island of Lesbos, where he continued his biological studies with his student Theophrastus. The lagoon of Lesbos proved ideal for observing marine life, and many of his most detailed observations date from this period. But larger events would soon pull him away from pure research. In 343 BCE, King Philip II of Macedonia summoned Aristotle to tutor his 13-year-old son Alexander. The connection forged generations earlier through Aristotle's father now bore unexpected fruit. Aristotle became the teacher of the prince who would become Alexander the Great, the conqueror who would spread Greek culture from Egypt to India. For 3 years, the philosopher educated the future king. What did Aristotle teach Alexander? Certainly literature, including Homer's Iliad, which Alexander would carry throughout his campaigns. Probably philosophy, ethics, and politics. Perhaps medicine and natural science. Alexander later funded Aristotle's research and sent back specimens from his conquests in Asia. The relationship between the contemplative philosopher and the man of action remained complex. Alexander conquered the world while Aristotle tried to understand it. Both, in their different ways, were seeking a kind of mastery. When Alexander became regent and then king following his father's assassination, Aristotle's tutorial duties ended. Around 335 BCE, now nearly 50 years old, Aristotle returned to Athens and founded his own school. He established it in a grove sacred to Apollo Lyceus, giving it the name Lyceum. Because Aristotle liked to walk while teaching, his school became known as the Peripatetic School, from the Greek word for walking. Here he would spend the most productive years of his life. The Lyceum differed from Plato's academy in significant ways. Where the academy emphasized mathematics as preparation for philosophy, the Lyceum pursued empirical research across every field of knowledge. Aristotle organized collaborative projects that collected and analyzed data about everything from political constitutions to animal anatomy. He assembled a library of maps, specimens, and manuscripts. The Lyceum was as much a research institute as a teaching institution. The range of Aristotle's investigations staggers the imagination. He wrote treatises on logic, developing the syllogism and the principles of valid inference that would dominate Western thought for 2 millennia. He wrote on physics, analyzing motion, causation, and the structure of the natural world. He wrote on biology, classifying hundreds of animal species and theorizing about their generation and development. He wrote on psychology, examining the nature of the soul and its faculties. He wrote on metaphysics, asking about being itself, about substance and accident, about potentiality and actuality. he wrote on ethics, developing a systematic account of virtue, happiness, and the good life. He wrote on politics, analyzing constitutions and arguing for the best form of government. He wrote on rhetoric, the art of persuasion. He wrote on poetics, analyzing tragedy and other literary forms. He wrote on the heavens, on meteorology, on the generation of animals, on the parts of animals, on the soul, on memory, on dreams. The sheer productivity is almost incomprehensible. Ancient catalogues list over 100 treatises. Many have been lost, including the polished dialogues that Aristotle wrote for popular audiences, praised in antiquity for their literary beauty. What survives are mostly lecture notes and research materials, dense and difficult texts that were never intended for publication. Yet even these fragmentary remains constitute one of the most influential bodies of work in human history. Let us examine some of Aristotle's key contributions, beginning with logic. Before Aristotle, reasoning was informal and unsystematic. People argued, sometimes well and sometimes badly, but there was no science of argument itself. Aristotle created that science. He identified the basic forms of propositions: universal affirmative, universal negative, particular affirmative, particular negative. He showed how valid conclusions followed necessarily from certain combinations of premises. The syllogism became his signature contribution. All men are mortal. Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. This form of reasoning, with its major premise, minor premise, and conclusion, could be analyzed and evaluated independently of any particular content. Aristotle mapped out which combinations of premises yielded valid conclusions and which did not. This formal analysis of reasoning would remain the foundation of logic until the 19th century and remains valuable today. Beyond the mechanics of inference, Aristotle developed concepts essential for all subsequent philosophy. The distinction between subject and predicate, between genus and species, between essential and accidental properties, all derive from his logical works. The categories he identified, substance, quantity, quality, relation, place, time, and others, provided a framework for classifying everything that exists. When we ask what something is, we often use Aristotelian categories without realizing it. In physics, Aristotle sought to understand change and motion in the natural world. He distinguished 4 types of causes that explained why things are as they are. The material cause was what something was made of. The formal cause was its structure or pattern. The efficient cause was what brought it into being. The final cause was its purpose or end. A statue, for example, had bronze as its material cause, its shape as its formal cause, the sculptor as its efficient cause, and decoration or commemoration as its final cause. This fourfold analysis of causation applied across all domains. Why does the acorn become an oak? Because it is made of organic matter with the potential for growth. Because the form of oak is encoded within it. Because parent trees produced it. Because the purpose of acorns is to become oaks. Aristotle's world was thoroughly purposive. Everything had a function, an end toward which it strived. This teleological worldview would dominate Western thought until the scientific revolution, and elements of it remain influential today. Aristotle's biology represented perhaps his most original contribution. He dissected and described over 500 animal species. He classified them according to their characteristics: blooded and bloodless, viviparous and oviparous, social and solitary. He traced their development from conception through maturity. He analyzed their parts and explained their functions. He asked why animals had the features they did and sought answers in terms of adaptation and purpose. His observations were remarkably accurate given the tools available. He correctly described the development of the chick embryo day by day. He noted that dolphins were mammals, not fish, based on their breathing and reproduction. He identified the function of the placenta in mammalian development. He recognized that some sharks gave live birth while others laid eggs. Not until Darwin would biology produce a mind of comparable scope and insight. The biological studies reinforced Aristotle's distinctive philosophical approach. Living things could not be understood through mathematics alone. They required careful observation of particular specimens, attention to variation and development, classification based on multiple criteria. The messiness of life resisted the clean abstractions Plato preferred. Aristotle embraced that messiness, finding in it not chaos but complex order waiting to be discovered. Metaphysics, the study of being as such, received systematic treatment in Aristotle's hands. He asked what it meant for something to exist, what made a thing the thing it was, how things could change while remaining themselves. His answers centered on the concepts of substance and form. A substance was a particular existing thing, this horse or that tree. Its form was what made it the kind of thing it was, what gave it its essential nature. The relationship between form and matter provided a framework for understanding change. Matter had the potential to receive different forms. When a sculptor worked bronze, the matter remained while the form changed. When an acorn grew into an oak, the matter transformed as the form developed. Potentiality and actuality became key concepts. Everything that existed was actual in some respects and potential in others. Change was the actualization of potential. At the summit of this metaphysical system stood the unmoved mover, pure actuality with no unrealized potential. This entity, which later thinkers would identify with God, caused motion not by pushing but by attracting. Everything in the cosmos strived toward the perfection that the unmoved mover represented. The heavenly spheres rotated eternally, inspired by love of this ultimate perfection. Aristotle's cosmos was not random or mechanical, but purposive, oriented toward the good. Ethics occupied a central place in Aristotle's thought, developed most fully in the Nicomachean Ethics, named for his son Nicomachus. He began with a question deceptively simple: what is the good for human beings? Everyone agrees we seek happiness, but what does happiness consist in? Pleasure? Wealth? Honor? Aristotle argued that none of these was the highest good because all were sought for the sake of something else. True happiness had to be sought for its own sake. His answer was eudaimonia, often translated as happiness but meaning something closer to flourishing or living well. Eudaimonia came from fulfilling our nature, from exercising our distinctive human capacities excellently. What distinguished humans from other animals was reason. Therefore, the best human life was one in which reason was exercised excellently, both in contemplation of truth and in governing action. Virtue was the excellence of character that enabled us to live and act well. Aristotle's treatment of virtue remains influential today. He defined virtue as a mean between extremes. Courage lay between cowardice and recklessness. Generosity lay between stinginess and extravagance. Each virtue required finding the right response to the situation, neither too much nor too little. This was not a mathematical middle, but a qualitative balance, determined by practical wisdom. The courageous act in one situation might seem foolhardy in another. Virtue was not natural, but developed through practice. We become courageous by doing courageous acts, just as we become skilled at music by practicing music. Habit shaped character. This had implications for education. The young needed to develop good habits before they could fully understand why those habits were good. Moral education required the right environment, the right examples, the right practice. Character was forged through action long before it was understood through reflection. The highest form of happiness came through contemplation, the exercise of our most divine faculty in understanding the deepest truths. The contemplative life, the life of philosophy and theoretical inquiry, represented the summit of human achievement. But Aristotle recognized that this life was not available to everyone or possible at all times. A complete human life also required practical virtue, friendship, sufficient resources, and good fortune. Happiness was vulnerable to circumstance in ways that troubled later philosophers. Friendship received extensive treatment, occupying 2 books of the Nicomachean Ethics. Aristotle distinguished 3 types of friendship, based on pleasure, based on utility, and based on virtue. Only the 3rd type was friendship in the fullest sense. True friends wished good for each other for the other's own sake. They spent time together, shared activities, and helped each other become better people. Such friendship was rare but essential for the good life. Political philosophy flowed naturally from ethics. Humans were by nature political animals, meaning we naturally lived in communities and achieved our good through common life. The isolated individual was either a beast or a god, not fully human. Politics was the master science, aiming at the good not of one person but of the whole community. The best individual life was possible only in the best community. Aristotle analyzed existing constitutions empirically before theorizing about the best regime. He collected information on over 150 Greek constitutions, classifying them by who ruled and in whose interest. Rule by one for the common good was kingship. For the ruler's interest, tyranny. Rule by few for the common good was aristocracy. For their interest, oligarchy. Rule by many for the common good was polity. For their interest, democracy. The best practical regime was a mixed constitution balancing different elements. Unlike Plato, who designed an ideal republic from first principles, Aristotle focused on what was achievable given human nature and existing institutions. He preferred moderate reforms to radical transformation. He valued stability and recognized that different peoples might require different arrangements. This pragmatic approach made his political thought more directly applicable than Plato's utopian vision. Aristotle was a reformer, not a revolutionary. The Poetics analyzed literature with the same systematic rigor Aristotle brought to everything else. He examined tragedy in particular, identifying its essential elements: plot, character, thought, diction, melody, and spectacle. Plot was primary, the soul of tragedy. A good plot had unity, taking a single action and developing it with probability and necessity. It aroused pity and fear, producing catharsis, a purification or clarification of these emotions. His analysis of tragedy influenced literary criticism for centuries. The three unities of action, time, and place that neoclassical critics attributed to Aristotle became rules for drama throughout Europe. His comments on character, on the tragic hero's hamartia or error, on the reversal of fortune and recognition, provided vocabulary for discussing literature that remains in use today. Even those who reject his specific views engage with his framework. Rhetoric, the art of persuasion, received similar treatment. Aristotle identified three modes of persuasion: ethos, the character of the speaker; pathos, the emotions of the audience; and logos, the argument itself. He analyzed the different types of rhetoric appropriate to different contexts: forensic rhetoric for courts, deliberative rhetoric for assemblies, epideictic rhetoric for ceremonial occasions. He examined the techniques by which speakers moved audiences and the ethical constraints on their use. Through all these diverse investigations, certain principles remained constant. Begin with careful observation of particulars before theorizing. Respect the complexity of the phenomena rather than forcing them into premature simplicity. Look for the mean between extremes, the balance appropriate to each situation. Seek final causes, purposes, and functions, not just mechanical explanations. These methodological commitments unified Aristotle's sprawling intellectual enterprise. The final years of Aristotle's life were overshadowed by politics. When Alexander the Great died in 323 BCE, anti-Macedonian sentiment surged in Athens. Aristotle, with his close ties to the Macedonian court, became a target. Charges of impiety were brought against him, the same charges that had killed Socrates a century earlier. Aristotle chose not to stay and face trial. He reportedly said he would not allow Athens to sin twice against philosophy. He withdrew to Chalcis, his mother's hometown, where he owned property. There, in 322 BCE, he died of a stomach illness at the age of 62. His will revealed a thoughtful and humane man. He provided for his slaves' eventual freedom. He arranged for his wife's bones to be joined with his. He made provisions for his children and his longtime companion Herpyllis. The dry treatises came from a person capable of love and care. The influence of Aristotle's thought extends far beyond what any summary can capture. His logic dominated Western education for 2 millennia. His natural philosophy, including the erroneous parts, shaped scientific understanding until the early modern period. His ethics remains taught in universities and debated by contemporary philosophers. His political theory influenced the development of constitutional government. His literary criticism established frameworks still in use today. The medieval period saw Aristotle become the philosopher, the supreme authority on almost every subject. Islamic scholars preserved and transmitted his works when they were lost to Western Europe. Thomas Aquinas synthesized Aristotelian philosophy with Christian theology, creating a framework that remains influential in Catholic thought. The scientific revolution defined itself partly against Aristotelian physics, but even that opposition testified to his continuing importance. Modern philosophy has returned to Aristotle repeatedly. Virtue ethics, long overshadowed by utilitarian and deontological approaches, experienced a revival in the 20th century, drawing heavily on Aristotelian foundations. His biology, dismissed during the mechanical philosophy's dominance, has been reassessed as anticipating modern evolutionary thinking. His political theory informs contemporary communitarian thought. The old philosopher remains surprisingly contemporary. What can we learn from Aristotle today? First, the value of systematic inquiry. Aristotle did not rest content with scattered observations or brilliant insights. He organized knowledge, built frameworks, developed methods. His comprehensiveness was not mere encyclopedism, but an attempt to understand how different domains of knowledge related to each other. In an age of increasing specialization, his integrative vision offers a valuable counterexample. Second, the importance of beginning with observation. Aristotle's empirical orientation checked the tendency toward speculation untethered from reality. He looked before he theorized. He revised theories when observations contradicted them. He collected data before drawing conclusions. This scientific attitude, learned perhaps from his physician father, remains essential for genuine understanding. We must see the world as it is before we can understand why. Third, the recognition that different subjects require different methods. Aristotle did not impose mathematical precision where it was inappropriate. Ethics could not be as exact as geometry because human action involved contingency and variation. Politics dealt with practical wisdom, not theoretical certainty. Each domain of inquiry had its own standards of rigor, its own appropriate methods. This methodological pluralism remains valuable. Fourth, the centrality of purpose in human life. Aristotle's teleological worldview may not apply to physics, but it seems indispensable for understanding human action. We act for reasons, seeking goals, pursuing goods. Ethics is about identifying the right goals and the best means to achieve them. Eliminating purpose from our understanding of human life impoverishes that understanding. Aristotle reminds us that the question "what for?" is always relevant. Fifth, the idea that virtue is developed through practice. We become what we repeatedly do. Character is formed by habit before it is understood by reason. This insight has implications for education, for self-improvement, for the design of institutions. If we want people to act well, we must create environments that encourage good habits. Moral exhortation alone is insufficient. Practice must be structured. Sixth, the necessity of community for human flourishing. Aristotle's insistence that humans are political animals challenges modern individualism. We do not create ourselves in isolation, but develop through relationships, institutions, and common projects. The good life requires friendship, requires citizenship, requires participation in shared endeavors. Excessive focus on individual rights neglects the social conditions that make individual flourishing possible. Finally, the example of a life devoted to understanding. Aristotle pursued knowledge not for money or power, but for its own sake. He believed that the contemplative life, the life devoted to understanding the deepest truths, was the highest human achievement. Even if we cannot fully share this valuation, even if practical demands limit our contemplation, we can appreciate the nobility of the ideal. Understanding matters, and those who dedicate themselves to it deserve honor. The Lyceum continued after Aristotle's death, led by his student Theophrastus, and then others, maintaining the tradition of research he had established. But nothing could replace the founder's comprehensive vision. Later peripatetics specialized, making important contributions in particular fields, but lacking Aristotle's unifying ambition. Philosophy would not see his like again until perhaps the 17th century, when the scientific revolution produced figures of comparable scope. As we conclude this journey through Aristotle's life and thought, remember that his works are not museum pieces but living resources. His questions remain our questions. What is the good life? How should we organize society? What is reality ultimately made of? How can we reason well? How can we live well? These questions have no final answers, but engaging with Aristotle's attempts illuminates our own inquiries. The philosopher from Stagira stands across the centuries, inviting us to join the conversation he advanced. Read his treatises if you can manage their difficulty. If not, engage with the traditions that flow from his thought. Practice the virtues he described. Pursue the understanding he valued. Participate in the communities that make human flourishing possible. In all these ways, you continue what Aristotle began. May his example inspire your own pursuit of wisdom. May his systematic spirit encourage you to organize your understanding. May his empirical orientation keep you grounded in observation, and may his vision of the contemplative life remind you that some goods transcend practical utility. The love of wisdom has no end. The conversation continues. You are welcome to join. Thank you for listening. Until we meet again, may understanding guide your way, and remember always that the unexamined life is not worth living, but the examined life, pursued with Aristotelian thoroughness, is rich beyond measure. Let us delve deeper into the practical wisdom that Aristotle offers for navigating the complexities of daily life. For philosophy that remains abstract serves little purpose. Aristotle himself insisted that the point of ethics was not merely to know what virtue was, but to become virtuous. Theory served practice, and practice tested theory. The wisdom of the ages must be lived to be truly understood. Consider Aristotle's doctrine of the mean and how it applies to decisions we face today. When confronted with a challenging situation, the extremes are often obvious and obviously wrong. The coward runs from every difficulty. The reckless person charges into every fight. Both fail. The courageous person assesses the situation and responds appropriately, sometimes advancing, sometimes retreating, always measuring response to circumstance. This principle extends to every domain of life. In spending money, the miser hoards while the spendthrift wastes. The generous person gives appropriately, considering their resources and the needs of others. In social situations, the boorish person says whatever comes to mind while the flatterer agrees with everything. The truthful person speaks honestly but with tact, considering the effects of their words. Finding the mean requires judgment, not formula. Aristotle emphasized that this judgment could not be reduced to rules. Practical wisdom, which he called phronesis, was a distinct intellectual virtue, the capacity to discern what action the situation required. No textbook could replace it. It developed through experience, through making decisions and observing their consequences, through learning from mistakes and successes. The practically wise person had an almost instinctive grasp of what to do, cultivated through years of practice. This has implications for how we approach moral education, both our own and that of others. We do not become good by studying ethics any more than we become musicians by studying music theory. Practice is essential. We must actually do courageous acts, actually exercise generosity, actually tell the truth when it is difficult. Each action shapes character, making the next similar action easier or harder. We are forming ourselves with every choice. The environments we inhabit matter enormously in this formation. Aristotle recognized that character developed in social contexts. We learn virtue by observing virtuous people and imitating their behavior. We develop habits through the expectations and encouragement of those around us. A society that celebrates vice makes virtue difficult. A community that models excellence makes excellence achievable. Choosing our environments is thus a moral decision with lasting consequences. Aristotle's analysis of friendship offers particularly rich guidance. In an age of social media connections numbering in the thousands, his distinction between types of friendship becomes crucial. Most of what we call friendship is actually based on utility or pleasure. We enjoy someone's company or find them useful for our purposes. Such relationships are fine as far as they go, but do not constitute deep friendship. They dissolve when the pleasure fades or the utility ends. True friendship, friendship based on virtue, is something rarer and more precious. True friends see and appreciate each other's character. They wish good for each other for the other's sake, not for what they can get from the relationship. They spend substantial time together, engaging in shared activities. They help each other become better people, providing honest feedback and moral support. Such friendships take time to develop and require maintenance through ongoing interaction. Aristotle noted that we can have only a few true friends. The depth of relationship required simply cannot be maintained with many people. This observation cuts against the contemporary tendency to maximize connections. Better to have 3 true friends than 300 acquaintances. Better to invest deeply in a few relationships than to spread attention thin across many. Quality matters more than quantity in friendships, as in most things that matter. The relationship between friendship and self-knowledge deserves attention. Aristotle observed that a friend was like another self, a mirror in which we could see ourselves more clearly. We are often blind to our own faults while perceiving those of others easily. A true friend, who knows us deeply and wishes us well, can offer observations about ourselves that we could not make alone. Friendship thus serves not only pleasure and utility, but the fundamental task of self-understanding. His treatment of pleasure and its role in the good life offers nuanced guidance. Aristotle was no hedonist, but neither did he reject pleasure as unimportant. He distinguished between pleasures, noting that some were intrinsically better than others. The pleasures of contemplation exceeded the pleasures of eating not merely in intensity, but in kind. The best life included pleasure, but as an accompaniment to virtuous activity, rather than as the primary goal. This analysis suggests a reorientation of how we pursue satisfaction. Rather than seeking pleasure directly, we should engage in excellent activities and allow pleasure to follow. The musician absorbed in performance experiences profound pleasure, but that pleasure comes from the music, not from seeking pleasure itself. Similarly, the pleasure of a virtuous life flows from the virtue, not from calculating how to maximize pleasant feelings. Aristotle's concept of eudaimonia, flourishing or living well, integrates multiple goods into a coherent vision of the best human life. Health, friendship, sufficient resources, intellectual activity, moral virtue, political participation, contemplation, all contribute to human flourishing. A life lacking any of these is to that extent deficient. The good life is not simple but complex, requiring balance among multiple goods. This complexity creates vulnerability. Unlike pleasure, which can be experienced in any circumstance, eudaimonia depends on external conditions partly beyond our control. Serious illness, betrayal by friends, political oppression, all can damage flourishing regardless of our virtue. Aristotle acknowledged this dependence on fortune and considered whether the happy person could become unhappy. His answer was nuanced. Virtue provided a stable core, but severe misfortune could indeed disrupt flourishing. Later philosophers, particularly the Stoics, would criticize this vulnerability. They argued that true happiness must be entirely within our control, unaffected by external circumstance. But perhaps Aristotle was more honest about the human condition. We are embodied, social creatures, dependent on others and subject to fortune. A conception of happiness that ignores these realities may be consoling but unrealistic. Aristotle preferred truth to comfortable illusion. His political philosophy extends these insights to the community level. Just as individuals need certain conditions to flourish, communities need appropriate structures. Laws should promote virtue, not merely prevent crime. Education should form character, not merely transmit information. The economy should provide sufficiency, not merely maximize wealth. Politics at its best aimed at the good life for all citizens, not merely the interests of those in power. Aristotle's analysis of constitutions remains instructive. He recognized that different forms of government could be legitimate depending on circumstances. Rule by one, few, or many could all serve the common good under the right conditions. What mattered was whether rulers governed for the benefit of all or only for their own advantage. Tyranny, oligarchy, and mob rule were corruptions not because of who ruled, but because of how they ruled. The mixed constitution that Aristotle favored combined elements of different regimes, balancing competing interests and preventing any single faction from dominating. This insight influenced later constitutional theory, including the American founders who designed a system of checks and balances, the separation of powers, The bicameral legislature, the federal structure all reflect Aristotelian principles of mixing and balancing to prevent corruption. His emphasis on the middle class as stabilizing force speaks to contemporary concerns. Aristotle observed that societies with large middle classes were more stable and better governed than those polarized between rich and poor. The wealthy tended toward arrogance, the poor toward resentment. Neither extreme produced the moderation required for good citizenship. A strong middle class, having enough but not too much, could govern itself without the distortions of great wealth or desperate poverty. The relationship between individual virtue and political structure presents a chicken and egg problem that Aristotle recognized. Good laws help form good citizens, but good laws require good lawmakers. How can the cycle begin? Aristotle suggested that outstanding individuals, founders and legislators, could establish institutions that shaped subsequent generations. Once established, good institutions created conditions for virtue even among those not naturally exceptional. This gives special importance to founding moments and constitutional design. The structures we create shape the people who will inhabit them. Poorly designed institutions corrupt even good people over time, while well-designed institutions elevate ordinary people toward virtue. We have a responsibility to bequeath to future generations not only material resources but institutional frameworks conducive to human flourishing. Aristotle's methodology in approaching these political questions combined empirical observation with normative analysis. He collected and analyzed actual constitutions before theorizing about the best regime. He considered what was achievable given human nature, not merely what was ideally desirable. He recognized that the same constitutional form might work better in one society than another. This contextual sensitivity made his political thought practically useful rather than merely theoretically elegant. Let us consider now how Aristotle's intellectual example might guide our own pursuit of understanding. He was above all a systematizer, someone who sought to organize knowledge into coherent frameworks. He asked about first principles, about the categories by which we classify reality, about the methods appropriate to different subjects. This concern for foundations distinguished genuine understanding from mere collection of facts. In an age of information overload, Aristotelian organization becomes essential. We have access to more data than any previous generation, but data without framework is noise. Making sense of the flood requires principles of selection, categorization, and interpretation. What matters? How do things fit together? What distinguishes reliable knowledge from mere opinion? These Aristotelian questions guide the transformation of information into understanding. His empirical emphasis reminds us that theory must answer to observation. Aristotle revised his ideas when evidence contradicted them. He spent years carefully observing before theorizing. He distrusted claims that could not be tested against experience. This scientific attitude, so obvious now that it seems trivial, was revolutionary in a philosophical culture that often valued logical deduction over messy observation. We should imitate his humility before the facts. At the same time, Aristotle recognized that pure observation was impossible. We always approached the world with prior concepts and assumptions that shaped what we noticed and how we interpreted it. The task was not to eliminate these frameworks, but to refine them through ongoing engagement with reality. Theory and observation developed together in a continuous process of mutual adjustment. Neither could proceed in isolation. His treatment of different domains as requiring different methods offers liberation from intellectual imperialism. Not everything worth knowing can be quantified. Not every question has a scientific answer. Ethics involves judgment that cannot be reduced to algorithm. Politics involves prudence that cannot be captured in formula. Recognizing the legitimate diversity of knowing frees us from inappropriate demands for certainty and precision in areas where they are not achievable. The contemplative life that Aristotle valued offers a counterweight to our activist culture. We prize doing, achieving, producing. Aristotle reminded us that understanding was also valuable, perhaps ultimately more valuable than action. The life spent trying to comprehend reality at its deepest levels was not an escape from real life, but engagement with what was most real. Those with leisure for contemplation should use it well rather than filling every moment with activity. This does not mean withdrawing from practical concerns. Aristotle himself was deeply engaged with political and social questions. The contemplative life was the best life for those able to pursue it, but most of life for most people involved practical action. The two modes complemented rather than contradicted each other. Understanding informed action, and action provided material for understanding. The wise person moved between theory and practice as circumstances required. Education occupied a central place in Aristotle's vision because it was the means by which virtue, both intellectual and moral, was transmitted across generations. He took education seriously as a social institution requiring careful design. What should be taught? In what sequence? By what methods? At what ages? These questions had no obvious answers and required philosophical reflection combined with practical experience. He would be troubled by contemporary debates that reduce education to job training. For Aristotle, education aimed at developing human capacities to their fullest, including capacities that had no direct economic application. Music, literature, philosophy, and theoretical sciences deserved places in the curriculum not because they enhanced productivity, but because they enriched human life. Education should produce not merely workers but citizens, not merely skilled individuals but good people. The role of habit in learning was central to Aristotle's educational thought. We do not learn virtue by being told about virtue, but by practicing virtuous acts until they become second nature. Similarly, we do not develop intellectual capacities merely by absorbing information, but by exercising those capacities repeatedly. Education required doing, not just receiving. The student must actively engage, question, practice, fail, and try again. Teachers therefore served as guides and models more than as transmitters of content. The good teacher demonstrated excellence in the relevant domain and structured experiences that allowed students to develop similar excellence. Aristotle himself presumably exemplified this teaching approach, thinking out loud with students, showing how to analyze problems, modeling the systematic inquiry he advocated. His surviving works may be lecture notes from such collaborative investigations. The institutional setting of education mattered. The Lyceum was not just a place where lectures happened, but a community devoted to inquiry. Students lived and worked together, creating an environment saturated with intellectual values. They had access to libraries, specimens, and research materials. They participated in collaborative projects extending beyond what any individual could accomplish. This institutional infrastructure enabled achievements impossible for isolated scholars. Modern universities descend from this tradition, though they have evolved considerably. The research university combines teaching, investigation, and publication in an institutional form Aristotle would recognize. The collaborative projects, the libraries and laboratories, the community of scholars pursuing truth together all reflect Lyceum principles. Of course, much has also changed, but the basic idea of institutionalizing the pursuit of knowledge persists. As we near the end of our journey with Aristotle, let us consider what it means to take his thoughts seriously today, not as a museum piece to be admired from a distance, but as a living resource for our own thinking, not as authority to be accepted uncritically, but as a partner in ongoing inquiry, not as a complete system to be adopted whole, but as a source of insights to be tested, refined, and integrated with other perspectives. His errors are instructive as well as his achievements. Aristotle was wrong about many things. His physics was largely superseded by Newton. His cosmology was geocentric. His biology, while impressive, contained many mistakes. His views on women and slaves reflected the prejudices of his time and cannot be defended. Recognizing these failures reminds us that even the greatest thinkers are limited by their circumstances. We too will be wrong about things that seem obvious to us now. Yet his method of inquiry has proven more durable than his specific conclusions. Begin with observation, organize what you find. Seek the causes and principles underlying appearances. Test theories against evidence. Recognize that different subjects require different approaches. Pursue understanding as intrinsically valuable. These methodological commitments guided Aristotle's investigations and can guide ours as well. The conversation he began continues in philosophy departments, in scientific laboratories, in political deliberations, in ethical reflections, wherever humans seek to understand reality and live well. His works remain studied not as historical curiosities, but as contributions to ongoing inquiry. The questions he asked are still our questions, even when his answers are no longer ours. Engaging with Aristotle means joining a conversation that spans millennia. May his example of systematic inquiry inspire your own pursuit of understanding. May his empirical orientation ground you in observation of the world as it is. May his ethical insights guide you toward virtue and flourishing. May his political thought inform your citizenship. And may his vision of the contemplative life remind you that understanding is itself a worthy end, not merely means to other goals. The philosopher from Stagira, teacher of Alexander, founder of the Lyceum, encyclopedic investigator of all reality, speaks to us still across 23 centuries. His voice joins ours whenever we ask what is real, what is good, how we should live. Listen to that voice, argue with it, learn from it, and add your own contribution to the endless conversation that philosophy is. Thank you for joining us on this exploration of Aristotle's life and thought. The pursuit of wisdom continues. May your own pursuit be blessed with the joy of understanding. Until we meet again, farewell, and remember that the life of contemplation, though difficult, is the most divine thing in us reaching toward its fulfillment. Before we part, let us return once more to the man behind the theories. For Aristotle was not merely an abstract thinker, but a human being who lived, loved, and lost like the rest of us. The details we have of his personal life reveal someone capable of deep attachment and thoughtful care for others. Philosophy for him was never divorced from the concrete texture of human existence. His marriage to Pythias appears to have been genuinely loving, unusual in a Greek world where marriages were typically arranged for practical purposes. When she died, Aristotle entered into a relationship with Herpyllis, perhaps a former slave in his household, who bore him a son named Nicomachus. His will provided generously for Herpyllis, requesting that his heirs care for her in recognition of her devotion to him. This was not the behavior of a cold rationalist, but of a man who valued and honored human connection. The Nicomachean Ethics, his great work on living well, was named for his son. Perhaps he wrote it partly as a guide for the young man, gathering the wisdom he had accumulated over a lifetime of reflection. The text addresses the reader almost intimately at times, as if philosopher and reader were engaged in conversation. We feel Aristotle's presence in its pages, not just his arguments. The Ethics was not just theory, but advice from a father who wanted his son to flourish. His relationships with students were also marked by genuine affection. Theophrastus, who would succeed him at the Lyceum, was clearly more than a mere pupil. The years they spent together on Lesbos, studying marine life and developing botanical research, created a bond that lasted until Aristotle's death. The philosophical school was a community of friends, not just an educational institution. Learning happened in the context of relationship. Even his relationship with Alexander, his most famous student, suggests personal concern beyond professional duty. Though their paths diverged dramatically after the tutorial years, Alexander continued to support Aristotle's research, and they remained in contact. The conqueror who subdued the Persian Empire and the philosopher who mapped the realms of knowledge represented different paths to greatness, but each apparently respected what the other had achieved. The circumstances of Aristotle's departure from Athens reveal a man who, despite his commitment to reason, understood the limits of argument in political contexts. When anti-Macedonian feeling made his position dangerous, he did not stay to defend himself philosophically. He had seen what happened to Socrates, who faced similar charges with principled refusal to flee. Aristotle chose differently, preferring exile to martyrdom. This was not cowardice, but practical wisdom, recognizing that death would serve no purpose. His final year in Chalcis must have been bittersweet. Removed from the Lyceum he had built, from the community of scholars he had assembled, from the research projects that had occupied his best years, he faced death far from the intellectual life that had defined him. Yet he continued to work, revising treatises, corresponding with students, maintaining the philosophical activity that had been his life's purpose. Even in exile, even in illness, the pursuit of understanding continued. When death came, it claimed a man who had sought to understand everything, including death itself. Aristotle had analyzed the soul, its faculties and functions, its relationship to the body. He had considered whether anything of the person survived physical death. His conclusions were ambiguous, leaving later interpreters to debate what he really believed. Perhaps he himself was uncertain, applying to this ultimate question the intellectual humility he brought to all his investigations. The legacy he left transformed human thought. Logic, biology, physics, metaphysics, ethics, politics, literary theory, rhetoric, all bore his imprint. For 2,000 years, to be educated meant to engage with Aristotle. Even the scientific revolution that overturned his physics did so by first mastering it. You cannot escape a thinker whose categories shape the very language in which you think. We are all, whether we know it or not, intellectual heirs of this physician's son from Stagira. But legacy is also personal. The students he taught, the colleagues he befriended, the family he loved, these too constitute what he left behind. Theophrastus preserved and continued his work. Nicomachus carried his name and presumably his teachings into the next generation. Herpillus remembered his kindness. These human connections mattered to Aristotle alongside the intellectual achievements. A life is more than its ideas. What then can we take from this complete picture of Aristotle, the philosopher and the man? Perhaps that the pursuit of understanding need not exclude warmth, that systematic inquiry can coexist with deep feeling, that the examined life includes examining our relationships and attachments as well as our concepts and arguments. Philosophy is not an escape from life, but a way of engaging more fully with all that life offers. The balance Aristotle sought in ethics, the mean between extremes, applied to his own existence. He was neither a hermit withdrawn from human concerns, nor a worldly success story measured only by external achievement. He pursued knowledge passionately, but also maintained friendships, raised a family, taught students, and cared for those around him. The good life he described was the life he tried to live. This integration of thought and life, of theory and practice, of contemplation and relationship, stands as perhaps his deepest teaching. We need not choose between understanding and living. The best life combines both, using understanding to guide action and action to test understanding. Philosophy is not preparation for life, but a way of living, not something done before engagement with the world, but in the midst of that engagement. As you return to your own life, carry some portion of Aristotle with you, not just his ideas, though those are valuable, but his example of a life devoted to understanding while remaining engaged with all that makes us human. Seek knowledge but also friendship. Pursue truth but also virtue. Contemplate the highest things but do not neglect the practical demands of daily existence. In this integration lies